Well, hello. I'm Gavin Bridge. I'm a professor of geography at Durham University in the UK. And it's a delight today to talk to David Hughes. David is a professor of anthropology at Rutgers about a new book that David has written called Who Owns the Wind? So, David, this is the first time we've really met. It's great to be able to have a conversation with you about the book. Perhaps we could start at the beginning. I'm thinking particularly about the geographical context of the book. It's set in Andalusia, in southern Spain, in a village that you anonymize as Sereno. And to give a bit of context here, this is on the north side of the Strait of Gibraltar. So it's positioned at the borders of Europe and North Africa, between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And as you illustrate really compellingly in the beginning of the book, this is an area which has got a high amount of wind. And it's in that context then that there's been a large number of wind turbines have been constructed. I wondered if you could help us understand a little bit about how you came to be in Sereno, what drew you to that area, and set the scene a little bit for us.
Sure. Well, first off, it's a pleasure to be with you, Gavin, and I'm very thankful to the AGS for putting on this session about my book. So I was interested in the energy transition, in helping to promote it, in fact, in a realistic, clear-eyed way. And so I wanted to look at a place that I saw as the future. And the future, I believe, involves wind turbines in a great number of places, solar farms too, really, and sometimes in inconvenient places, sometimes a bit underfoot and in the backyard. And so I found Sereno, which may be the most turbine surrounded village in the world. I believe it's in Europe. I believe it's probably uncontested that it's most surrounded by turbines. And that's because, as you say, it's a wind corridor there in between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It's surrounded by turbines also because of some historical property questions, which I can get into maybe a little bit later. So I arrived and I found people not enjoying this kind of future utopia one bit, very much opposed to it. They had, in fact, protested about 10 years before I got there against the wind turbines and had lost. But their protest had been heard on a wider scale, and they had actually almost entirely stopped the installation of wind turbines in that corner of Andalusia. So the energy transition, so these are people with power who brought the energy transition to its knees. And my inquiry then was figuring out what are their actual complaints. They're not reducible to simple NIMBYism or reactionary or conservatism, and certainly not reducible to denial of climate change. I found, in fact, in their criticisms, a lot of extremely useful lessons for promoters of the energy transition away from fossil fuels.
So yes, you describe Sereno, this village of around 400 people. You describe it at one point as a shanty town, and you're using that word not in a derogatory way. You're pointing to some specific relationships of property. I wonder if you could unpack that for us a bit, because that has a central motivating role in the story and in the account. I wonder if you could explain that for us a little.
Absolutely. So one of the reasons why there are lots of wind turbines here, one of the non-Aeolian reasons that don't have to do with physical geography, has everything to do with the history of property. So Andalusia was conquered by Castilians between the 13th and 15th centuries against various Moorish polities. And they really brought too few Spaniards to settle it very thoroughly. So it went through a period of underdevelopment where irrigation systems fell into disuse, and where agricultural productivity fell very dramatically. I apologize here. I'm turning off my email so it doesn't sound. And even to this day, the population density is very low outside major towns, and that frees up land for these aristocratic families, which do go back to that Spanish conquest. And so the land concentration is enormously, it's very pronounced. These are latifundios owned by latifundistas, and one of the bizarre twists of the law, which hasn't really fully been adjudicated or explained, but as a kind of path of least resistance, landowners own wind. And so there's a lot of money to be made by a small number of people in ways that are very efficient for industry by having wind farms on large estates. Now, the villages there, as descendants, mostly descendants of landless peasants, that's a bit of a contradiction term. Let's say landless day laborers, jornaleros, as is known locally, who lived in the sierras, in the hills, the ridges around this valley, up until the 1980s, when the government evicted them all for the sake of a military reserve. And so they went down into this valley, owned entirely by latifundistas, except for the cattle trail, Via Pecuaria. And this widening, this place where it widens around a stream, which is known as a descansadero, or a overnighting kind of resting place for cattle. Now, the latifundistas historically raised, as I said, they didn't really capitalize on the land. They mostly used it for stock raising. And in fact, in this particular area, for the very extensive stock raising of cattle for the bull ring. But the Via Pecuaria was in disuse because people started moving cattle by trucks and things. So this was actually a common property owned by an elite, controlled by an elite, which was then available for squatting, and people did that. They know how to construct. Their houses began as shanties, but got quite more elaborate than that. And they paid fines / bribes to get hooked up to the electrical and water grids. But still, a large portion of these parcels are not legal. And that's another reason why there are wind turbines so close to this village, because the legal limit in Spain is 0.5 kilometer from a registered house. But there's no legal limit in front of a house that does not exist on the cadastre. And so, in fact, turbines are 300 meters or so from the nearest actual houses.
Thanks for explaining that. And I think the theme that really struck me is how acute those inequalities of property are in the case that you're looking at. And I suppose part of the overall account here is that from this particular context, from the specificities of this part of Andalusia, one can think about a broader set of relationships that attend to renewable energy, the relationship to land in particular. As the book unfolds, you spend a really nice account of that kind of landed quality of renewables, the lower power densities associated with renewables, a number of people have sketched out and explained, and how that question of land then comes back to the fore. So there's a really fascinating argument going on in the book, which is, and I think it's quite, your formulation of it is quite specific, where you say in the opening parts that wind needs justice. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, because it seemed to me that you're not making a straightforward claim, which is that renewables, we need to be conscious of questions of justice around them. It's a more fundamental claim, which is something about the need to roll out renewables at scale, and how, because these will necessarily involve relationships with land, that if this is going to succeed, this has to be done in a way that delivers forms of justice. I wonder if you could elaborate that a little bit for us.
Sure, absolutely.
Something quite particular to what you're saying there about the relationship between renewables and broader questions of justice.
Yes. So the crux of the issue is the difference between being landed and being horizontal.
Right.
So we know renewables, I mean, there are 162,000 terawatts of solar hitting they hit the atmosphere. About 80,000 or so make it to hit and stay on the planet's surface. So that's a very, we can't even really talk about it as density because it's only got 2 dimensions. But in any case, it's a very distributed resource. And in order to get off of, to cease burning fossil fuels, we have to harvest that resource, and it has to be done horizontally. Now, the most simple-minded way to harvest anything horizontally is to say, well, it's a territorial resource, and the rights and authority and so on follow from the landowner. And there's a lot of historical basis regarding solar energy to make that association, right? Because anybody who's been farming crops has been harvesting photons for millennia. That goes back to the Neolithic. And it's a little late in the game, unfortunately, to tell the farmer, well, you don't have access to those photons. We're going to put up a solar panel on top of your crop. I mean, there are various compromises in agrivoltaics, but you can't really, in the basis of law, just overshadow somebody's crop. However, wind is very different. It has mostly not been used and not been claimed. It is flowing, it's not falling on land the way rain and sunlight does. It's flowing across one piece of land over to another one, moving laterally. And there's a logical reason to think that we could detach it from land. We can harvest it horizontally without reference. I mean, obviously there has to be some negotiation because you're talking about you begin from the planet's surface. You have to extend a wind turbine upwards, but the adjudication with the landowner should start, I think, on the principle that the landowner doesn't own the wind, that somebody else does. And that's why I make the argument for a wind commons. And in fact, to establish a wind commons is much easier than to carry out land reform, because Spaniards tried for a couple of centuries to carry out land reform, didn't succeed. I've been involved in that project in Southern Africa, and sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it fails. Often a bloody struggle. It's actually easier to carry out wind reform, I think, because there's no interest group, no very strong interest group right now asserting wind rights. Can I circle back to solar,
Yes,
Gavin? Because I
please.
actually have a quick article that came out, short article that came out in the Boston Review called Use Sunlight Locally or Use It. And I'm making a different argument about property with respect to sunlight and trying to leverage some force off of the Homestead Act in the United States going back to 1862. The Homestead Act said that, you can have this land as a settler in the West for free from the federal government, but you have to improve it, right, to prove it up over 5 years, or else it reverts back to the federal government. One can make the argument in urban or non-agricultural areas that people are failing to use, they're wasting sunlight. If Amazon, for example, owns acres and acres and acres of warehouse, and that sun is not even falling on a skylight, just falling on a roof and contributing to the urban heat island effect, one could seize that surface by climbing up on the roof, fixing the roof if necessary, putting panels on top of the roof, connecting them to the grid, and generating urban solar electricity, possibly community owned, contributing to a resilience hub or something for urban residents, without the permission of Amazon. Or one could threaten Amazon with all this and get them to do it themselves. So that's the way. That's the way you turn the property equation for the benefit of the public with respect to solar. But I'm saying it's more logical and easier to do that with respect to wind already.
That's really fascinating. And one thing that struck me in some of the discussions in the book is the relationship between the way that the histories of oil and gas, for example, with respect to subsurface resources, can potentially offer, somewhat surprisingly, one might think, offer some parallels here for thinking about what property relations around the wind might be. I'm thinking particularly of the example of the split estate, the ability to separate the surface from the subsurface. Key to your argument seems to be to separate wind from the surface, so that you'd have an existing arrangements of property in land, but actually the wind resource could be socialized, could be nationalized and held separately. And of course, there are parallels there with the nationalization of subsurface resources that seem to be a direct parallel. Is that the way that you are visualizing this aeolian commons, a wind commons?
Yes. I mean, what you probably picked up on, Gavin, is that I like to work with existing traditions. There's a lot of socialism in this book, but I actually like to get there through existing traditions. So Alaska, for example, Republicans in Alaska have a fantastic tradition of public ownership of subsurface resources, which gives every Alaska resident a check from what they call the permanent fund every year. Unfortunately, it makes hydrocarbons very popular among Alaskans. But that's a fabulous principle of saying, the world is built in layers. And just because you own the one we're on right now doesn't mean you own the one below it, and it doesn't mean you own the one above it. The other principle that unfortunately may travel over from hydrocarbons to renewables is the idea of reserves. As you've written very persuasively, and I put it in my last book too, the problem with the oil industry has been one of managing abundance. And the way they do this is by establishing this category of reserves, which is all the oil, gas, or I'm not sure if it works this way with coal, but anyway, all the oil and gas that you can make a profit on at current prices, technology, and one other thing, regulation. So you'll never lose money if you exploit reserves, and reserves always seem just a little bit scarce enough to justify a high price at the pump. So what some investors in renewables would like to do is establish this category that you call wind and solar reserves. And those are the places where you have access to the land. And where the investment prices, access to the land under regulation, the technology doesn't really matter because it's all good. But they'd like to make us believe that wind energy is scarce because the sites for it are scarce. And this is one of the reasons why I suspect, I put some evidence for this in the book, that the wind industry is not altogether heartbroken at these local protest movements, because these local protest movements keep wind generated kilowatts just a little bit scarce, and the protest movements and other kinds of obstacles give another generation of life to natural gas. You have to bear in mind that the apex investors, so eco-investors and so on, in renewables are also very often investing in natural gas. And so this slow energy transition that we're doing now serves their interests very well. I mean, except to the extent that they probably have children and grandchildren, and they want to maintain the conditions for life on planet Earth, but that doesn't appear on the balance sheet, as we know.
Yeah. So we've dealt a little bit there with a theme of property and property relations that runs through the book, and clearly it's headlined in the title, this question of ownership or off the wind. There's a secondary theme in the book that I found really fascinating, and that's mainly to do with the aesthetics and the question of how we should think and identify with wind and with landscape. And the argument there that the aesthetics of the kind of monstrosity of intrusive wind turbines, that we need to shift that. There's a really nice little visualization of that where you describe kind of the 90-degree shift. If you look at wind turbines face on, they have a particular aesthetic to them of these kind of mildly rotating discs, if you like. But then if you look at them end on from 90 degrees, you see there's a series of blades slicing through things. And you've got some great examples in the book of that. But this theme of the aesthetic, I think, is really fascinating. What drew you to that? I imagine that's partly through your anthropological training of listening to how people think and talk to you. But I wonder if you could kind of flesh that out for us.
Well, I wrote a book earlier called Whiteness in Zimbabwe, which looked at aesthetic sensibilities around water among European settlers in Southern Africa. And basically, they constantly romanticized water because in some ways it reminded them of England and of that kind of waterscape that it's a bit like the Lake District or something, that moderate blend of water and shore. But I learned anyway, the gaze is never innocent. There's ideology involved, there's history involved, and everything about the history of this place cries out against wind turbines, because they bring a different profile, they bring different materials, different sounds to what's otherwise a landscape of cattle and wheat and sunflower. And if I were living in this place, having grown up there without the noise of traffic, without the noise of cars and so on, yeah, I would feel this as an imposition, especially if the latifundistas were making all the money off it and I was making none and getting no jobs and so on. So I write with a great sympathy for the Sereneños, for my informants. But I'm actually, and I'm embracing all their economic criticisms and trying to bring a solution in the form of the wind commons. In terms of their aesthetic objections, I'm actually pleading with them, you might say, to compromise a bit. And there's also a tradition of compromise. This landscape pretty nearby has bunkers and artillery 8 meters long aiming at Morocco because Franco thought that the French would invade from Morocco or something like that. And now tours go on there and people admire this stuff. Some years have passed. Raymond Williams always predicts that it takes 50 years for people to get used to some form of capitalist or state intrusion on the countryside. So one could wait 50 years, but we don't have 50 years to wait. We want to have a quicker energy transition than that. So the other part, in addition to tradition, history, ideology, and so on, that conditions the way we see the landscape is the way we choose to see it. And what I suggest in the book is you almost never look at something without a memory of having seen it before, except of course the first time you look at something. But when you look at it the second time and the third time, your impression is colored by what you've seen before, and maybe it's colored by the worst it ever appeared to you, or maybe by the best it ever appeared to you. If you think of the Golden Gate Bridge, or many bridges, the experience of driving over it is just looking at traffic. And maybe you see, if it's a suspension bridge, you see the cables above you. But you always have in your mind's eye that, hey, this bridge has this beautiful arc, and the suspension too has this tremendous arc between two peninsulas or something, because you've seen it at a 90 degrees, you've seen it the other way. You've seen the Golden Gate Bridge from across the bay in Berkeley, and remembering that as you drive across it and just look at a bunch of cars in front of you and on the sides of you. So I'm hoping that people in these kinds of turbine adjacent landscapes can hold on to the best view of the turbine and know that the turbine that appears ugly today because the blades are cutting against each other is the same turbine that tomorrow is going to appear beautiful because each rotor is clean up against the sky with a mist around it or something like that.
Yeah. So it strikes me that you have to work quite hard to identify and recover and give voice to some of those alternative imaginaries around turbines. And you spend quite a lot of time hanging out with a range of people to try and flesh that out in almost in some ways to try and provoke that sense of understanding. What might there be there? So you go to the obvious places, you talk with painters and photographers, but you also spend quite a bit of time talking with engineers. And then with this group of people who I certainly wasn't aware of, the Vigilancia, essentially paid bird watchers who identify migrating species across this major flyway, to better understand some of the ways, the multiplicity of ways in which people think about the turbines. And there's quite a striking bit. Perhaps I might just read a couple of lines, if you don't mind. I find this perhaps the most challenging section of the book in the sense of what you're proposing, and I wonder if you can help us understand it. So. You say, page 169, for those who may have a book with them, perhaps we need an energy platform filled with metal and cement and the black silica of solar panels, all of it covering and obscuring the landscapes we once loved. So, for many people who live in and around turbines or who are facing them, being on land that they know and love, this is a rather striking proposition that actually we should want this, we should ask for this, we should desire this. And of course, you're making quite an important point about this. You're not suggesting wanton destruction or somehow that people have misunderstood and this is all fine. You're making a point about how we need to think about the memorialization of the fossil fuel society. And I wonder if you might sort of elaborate that for us, because that seemed to me quite an important reckoning, if you like, with the moment that we're in.
Yeah. So, there are some, I try to build up to it, but there are some emotional pitches in this, emotional turns in this book. So there, I'm admitting to the possibility of failure, that maybe I won't persuade, maybe nobody will persuade people in Spain or in the UK or in the US to really enjoy the romance and the sublime quality of 100 wind turbines around their village. Now, how bad would that be if we failed? If we just found wind turbines ugly and it took 50 years or even more for us to get used to them? And so here I'm writing for members of the 1 billion high emitters in the world who have brought about the necessity to put wind turbines everywhere in order to preserve the conditions for life on planet Earth. And I'm using the pronoun we, but I know there are people in the audience who are outside this 1 billion. It's a subsection of humanity that has caused this problem. Of course, even within the 1 billion, there are the super rich and the CEO of ExxonMobil and people like that who have enormous responsibilities. I could think of something else to do with a wind turbine blade to them. But do we really deserve a landscape unaltered, right? I mean, what have we done to claim all of this beauty, to even to call it nature, and to want nothing to touch it, right? I mean, if you don't like wind turbines, then maybe that's the penance. Maybe we shouldn't even like wind turbines. We should just suck it up because we brought this upon ourselves. That's the reckoning. So, but I do hope that I persuade people to love wind turbines.
So that's part of the aesthetic argument that's going on here. This need to imagine and think differently and identify ways of coming to terms with a set of technological interventions in the landscape and what they mean for moving beyond fossil fuels. And then that's allied with your political economic argument about property and the nature of the possibilities for ownership of the wind. I think yes, maybe our editors can help us with this little bit. But perhaps I could turn David to another aspect of the book, which is really your what we might call the art of the anthropologist, the skill and the craft of doing field work. And I really enjoyed, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is the possibilities of language, the way that you work with interrogating phrases and understandings in Spanish and how they translate or don't into English. So the ambivalences and triangulations that are possible working between languages. And there's some really neat little examples of that. So this distinction between campo and campina as ways of understanding sort of productive use of land versus its kind of harvesting, its bounty, its ability to give up a set of goods. And then this question of language around solidarity and sort of the impossibility of completely translating an adjective around the notion of solidarity. I wonder if you could just reflect for us a little bit about that process, your fieldcraft, if you like, and what that was like for you living in, returning back and forth to the village that you call Sereno. As part of the research for the book?
Well, this was the most enjoyable and in some way the most hardcore field work I've done. over time and in the course of one's career, ethnography often devolves to interviews. And that had happened to me to some extent, partly because I was interviewing in the previous book, oil elites, and it's difficult to just hang out with them. But here I arrived in this village and asked, where do people go to talk about politics, and was sent immediately to one of the 4 bars. It's a 400-person village with 4 bars. And I spent hours and hours there every day. I was still learning Spanish. I spoke Portuguese, but I needed to convert that to Spanish, which wasn't as easy as I thought because people speak with a very thick accent in this area. So initially I paid a lot of attention to body language, and I think I talk about some of the gestures that people use as well. I paid a lot of attention to the interpersonal dynamics and who speaks to whom and so on. Eventually I got out of the bars too, and I hung out with people at some of their work and the walks that they take and things like that, visiting with family in their houses. So I think you have to do that. I mean, the book, the kind of meta narrative of the book is that the energy transition involves much more than engineering. It involves a social transformation, which requires that we understand today's society so that we can move it, so that its participants can move it in a way that achieves more justice rather than less justice. The way things are going, as we consider the energy transition to be an engineering problem, we're heading towards less justice in a corporate controlled wind and solar sector. So I really wanted to understand how people saw power, how they saw property, how they saw gender, all kinds of things. And to do that, I had to live with them, and I wanted to. And then you're constantly observing. I mean, that's basically participant observation. And it helps to be an outsider, I believe, because then I was alive to those things you mentioned, those little turns of phrase, little assumptions buried in the lexicon.
Yeah. So there's a cast of around, I think, 20 characters or so who kind of populate the book, and you've anonymized them. And I was thinking about the choices you must have had to make as an author of what to disclose, what not to disclose. There must have been some sort of challenging moments in thinking that through. These are people you got to know pretty well, some of them at least, and some of them are folks who would have been quite challenging to come to know, I imagine, some of the politics involved. And there are several times in the book where you kind of disclose some of the sort of interpersonal atmospherics that go along, the way people, consider your questions repetitive or consider your questions dull, because, these are the world in which they inhabit, and there you are asking questions all the time about the turbines. I thought that was kind of a really nice little move, because I'm aware of what that's like doing field work.
Well, one of the things I teach graduate students is when you're an astronomer, the instrument is the telescope. Right. And you polish your telescope or whatever, you make sure it's working, but you don't write a great deal about the telescope because you assume it works. When you're an anthropologist, the instrument is yourself. Yeah. You're there, and you're not just collecting data through a lens, you're interacting to collect it. And your presence is part of the story, part of the data. Now, some anthropologists take this a little too far, and they talk about themselves more than about the context in a book. But I do think it's certainly relevant that I provoked reactions by people. I think being an outsider as well, and such a foreigner, allowed people to trust me more, because they knew I didn't have a stake in the wind politics or in any politics either way.
So there's 2 other areas I wanted us to discuss in the time that we have. So the first of these is really to think about what one can learn from a village of 400 people in southern Spain, because you make an expansive argument about the politics of wind, and a proposal effectively for how wind resources can be better allocated in a way that can encourage the further uptake of renewables. So the question really is whether you style, towards the end, you style this cast of 20 characters as being, they are the everyman, the everywoman. They stand for other people in other places. And I'm just wondering whether your proposal, you style it as being willfully utopian. And so that requires, I think, a little bit of unboxing to explain what you mean by utopian in that context. Because it struck me that your proposal is actually quite a practical one when it comes down to it. You have a solution. You might be clear-eyed about the challenges of delivering that solution, but you do have one. And I wonder if you can kind of explain that willfully utopian aspect of it for us.
Well, in that case, I was writing against some literature that's come out from people like Roy Scranton and Jonathan Franzen, less academic and more popular writers who are just talking about doom. It's become fashionable. I mean, in the US, we seem to have jumped from denialism through the phase of doing anything about it already over to resignation in some quarters. Certainly not among the youthful demonstrators that I hang out with, but certainly in some quarters. And I write against that because partly I believe, as Albert Hirschman may have said this, the purpose of writing anything is to enlarge the possibilities for action rather than to justify pessimism, right? So I'm not going to write about doom because I'm not actually adding anything. I'm not giving the writer anything to work with. So
it's a crowded marketplace as well.
as well, yeah. And there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know where tipping points of runaway climate change are. And so I'd rather focus on what we can do. And as you say, thank you for that. I did by the end of it come up with some very practical suggestions. On the question of this village, I think you were asking how representative, you're asking some question along the line of how representative it is. One of the things anthropologists do, and this is true of many geographers as well, is we argue from extremes. Sociologists, I often think, argue from the mean. So I like to go for the extreme case. So here it is, an extreme case, a village of poor people without property, without significant assets, surrounded by latifundios and turbines, with radical inequality, and just in terms of the level of crowdedness, very extreme. And so, yeah, it's definitely extreme, but I think it's representative of the future that we need. So because I'm hopeful, I want there to be many, many more Serenos out there. You know, my town could be a Sereno. It's larger than 400, but anyway, it could be surrounded everywhere. You find free land. It could be surrounded by solar panels and wind turbines. So I found this place, which to me is a slice of the future utopia. Utopia simply being defined as a place where human and non-human life prevails in the 22nd century. And I want to make it work, right? So it has a lot of flaws, namely that people in Sereno are unhappy enough to stop the energy transition, to prevent that utopia from spreading beyond Sereno. And so that's where I come up with the practical solutions. But none of this would have happened if I had gone to a place fighting wind turbines for the first time. That would have been Sereno 15 years ago. And this wouldn't have happened if I'd done the kind of willingness study or you know, that people often do to see who wants wind turbines or under what conditions and so on. I had to go in a place where the whole thing was tangible, was material, was fought over, was, you know, struggled over and cried and moaned over. And that's what I found.
So the final question in my mind, I'm trying to place your account of wind on a spectrum, and it's clear that your agenda around the political economy of wind is one that puts the wind resource into public hands, that socializes its ownership, nationalizes its ownership. But it also appears as if you're a bit agnostic actually about the social organization of the wind sector itself. So as long as the resource was in public hands, would it be fair to say you would be comfortable with corporations running the wind power sectors, large corporate players in that sector as opposed to community-owned wind farms themselves. The actual mode of industrial organization, if you like, is open to you. That's not the piece of the puzzle that you're seeking to understand. It's more about the ownership of the resource that is key for you. So I'm trying to place this on various, accounts of the democratic potential of the renewable sector, and trying to understand whether your agenda is effectively an anti-capitalist agenda or not. And I didn't come to the conclusion that it was. You towards the beginning, in the context of solar energy, you talk about a photonic form of capitalism. After Carboniferous capitalism, we moved to sort of photonic phase, if you like. So capitalism as a whole is alive and well in your future, but the resource is publicly held. That's the key thing that has to change. Is that a fair characterization of where you stand on this?
That's a fair characterization of some of the deliberate vagueness in the book. Absolutely. I mean, so I'm trying to appeal to all kinds of people. There's a group of a political lobby group in the US which funds Republicans and Democrats. Actually reached out to me about 2 weeks ago. One of them had read this book and they want to involve me somehow in ideas. So to me, that's success. The reason that I'm a little bit quiet about ownership of the infrastructure and the equipment is, first of all, trade unions for energy democracy and some other groups are making great arguments about public ownership. Mm-hmm. And that fight is going to happen. I think that fight is part of the larger fight of which goes on all the time in socialism to reclaim privately held resources for the public. And certainly I would support that. That's going to be a long road. I'm in fact trying to do something different, which is a shortcut. And the reason I didn't say a lot about public ownership of the infrastructure is that I wanted to really put this shortcut into sharp relief. And what's new about it is that here you have a resource so much larger than fossil fuels that nobody is actively claiming now at all, except in a few spots like Sereno, but mostly it's a resource that people don't even realize is there because it can't be seen, it can't be held. Same thing with sunlight. People don't tend to think about it as in material terms whatsoever. So here we have this huge frontier that can't even really be mapped. And if we do nothing, capital will seize it. So I'm anti-capitalist in that respect, absolutely, in the book. If we do something, the public can seize it. And I think it's actually not that difficult a fight, right? Because the lines of opposition are not drawn. And it's much easier to take from capital something they don't have already, even if it's huge, than to take this little thing, which is the global grid and the global energy infrastructure and all the fossil fuels, than to take that from capital when they know they hold it and they really treasure it.
Thank you very much, David.
So, actually to add to that, Gavin, so what's really going on here, I think, is that we have Earth, and then we have the subterranean energy resources, and we have this huge aeolian photonic resource, which is just like another solar system. And we could do socialism there, and we could abandon the subterranean resources whose exploitation always causes harm. And so I don't need to reform capitalism with respect to fossil fuels, because we can just throw that away and move on to this whole new place. And this is like the utopian thing, start over. That's, I think, what I'm trying to say.
Thanks very much, David. It's a really powerful vision. And as you say, willfully utopian in the sense of giving us a sense of possibility of where action can happen. I want to thank you for the book, for the opportunity to read it and to think about it, and for coming to understand a little bit more about Andalusia and some of its remarkable history. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Gavin. This was a pleasure.